guys, it's Vera here. Welcome to my first review video. Last week I tried for the first time Acrylic Gouache. I was very excited about it because I bought my Acrylic Gouache supplies already 1 month ago, but I didn't really have the courage to try them out before. I started painting with gouache over a month ago, maybe 3 months ago, and before that I sticked only to watercolor, and I became super familiar with watercolor and I thought it's time to learn a new medium. So then I started painting with normal gouache paint. However, acrylic gouache is a completely different category and I was very eager to try out that medium. So just for those of you who don't know what gouache paint is at all, if you know what watercolor is, watercolor paint and then acrylic paint, then you can imagine that gouache paint is something right in between. So it's still a water-based medium. It can have the properties of watercolor. However, it is much more creamy. It has more pigment and more binder inside. So you can really create a very nice matte and opaque, so the opposite of transparent, effect on the paper. And then we have acrylic gouache or acrylic gouache, which by the way is super difficult to get. I really had to order abroad and it's really hard. In Germany it's impossible to get that gouache, acrylic or acrylic gouache. Whenever I ask in the shop, all the shopkeepers looked at me like crazy. They didn't even know that this medium exists. So it was like this holy grail for me to get my hands on that paint and to try it out. So basically, long story short, what you need to know about normal gouache versus acrylic gouache is the difference in the drying and whether you can do something about it once it dries. With normal gouache, yeah, you can still reactivate it even if you have some on your palette and you want to use the paint a few days later for another painting, you can do that with normal gouache. But acrylic gouache behaves much more like acrylic, and once it dries forever. You cannot do anything with it, you cannot reactivate it. I wanted to show you a few color swatches so that you see how this paint behaves. I have here Ordinary Gouache by Schminke, and I have two brands of acrylic gouache, Turner Acryl Gouache and Holbein's Acryla Gouache. So I prepared my IKEA plate as my palette and I started to prepare the paint. Gouache is a very nice creamy paint. I really like its texture and I like the process of preparing the paint on the plate. The first color swatch that I prepared was using the Ordinary Normal Gouache by Schminke. The texture of the paint is very creamy and it's very easy to put it onto paper. Next color swatch is made using Turner Acryl Gouache, and you will notice that the texture is very similar, so it just looks like gouache. It's still very creamy. You can see that it's very well pigmented and the color is really vibrant. And finally, the third color swatch, Holbein's Acryla Gouache. It's supposed to be the best. It's also twice as expensive as Turner's Acrylic Gouache, but it's also supposed to be much better quality, and to be honest guys, I think it really is much better quality. Even when I was painting, I could see that it's much more pigmented, the texture is just nicer. Overall, I think it's really worth the price. Okay, so the shapes are done. They're also dry. It's been at least 5 minutes. And it's super interesting now to look at the palette, the plate that I was using. And if you're familiar with normal gouache, you know that choosing too much color on the palette, squeezing too much paint out is not a problem. And here this is the case. Even though the paint has already dried, it's enough to get a little bit of water and I can reactivate it and paint with it again. Now once we get to Turner's Acryl Gouache, it starts to get a little bit more nasty. It's acrylic polymer, so you will see that it dries and then it's game over. It forms really clumpy bits and all you can really do is just wipe it off and get rid of it. Holbein's Acryla Gouache would actually behave in the very same way. However, I've noticed that it dries much later. So it's really awesome because you can use this paint longer. Acrylic gouache is much better if you like working with layers, if you want to put multiple layers one on another in your painting. Whereas with normal gouache, you might notice that you really gotta be careful with the water. If you use a little bit too much, then you're much more likely to reactivate the layers that are underneath, and sometimes you're not able to fix it anymore and you're messing up in your painting. With acrylic gouache, there is no danger like that once you allow the first layers to dry completely. So I dab my brush with some extra water and then I put this water onto acrylic gouache, and you see nothing happens at all, so it's safe once it dries. And then going to normal gouache, you can still reactivate it, like days, weeks, months later, you can still lift the paint. I really wanted you guys to finally enjoy the speed paint without me talking. So just right at the beginning of this video, let me sum up the biggest learning for you that I gathered from myself after my first experience painting with acrylic gouache. Number one, have some extra water and be really careful about your brush. It behaves just like acrylic, so if it dries on your brush, it can really damage it. Have plenty of water. Tip 2, when you drastically change between the colors, for example, I changed from this peachy color to this darker navy blue color, it's really recommendable to go to the kitchen or to the bathroom and to clean your brush thoroughly with soap in between those colors that differ a lot, or to use two separate brushes, because this acrylic gouache paint is a little bit more rough. There might be some residue left that you will not notice, and then it mixes up with the paint that you're using later. Tip 3, squeeze out only a small amount of paint, or even use just a little bit of it directly from the tube, because it dries very quick. You need to be pretty fast with the colors, otherwise you have a whole bunch of wasted paint, which then you just have to throw away, and it's really a shame because it's so hard to get those paints. Here, a little cheat trick. You will see in the video that I've noticed at some point that I squeezed out too much paint. I was actually able to grab it with my brush and put it back into the tube. So it works. Yeah, whatever works, just do that. Save the paint. Tip 4, use acrylic gouache when you really like working with layers. So work with multiple layers and make sure that the previous layer completely dries before you proceed to the next one. And finally, tip 5, do not be afraid to use water with acrylic gouache. It's easier to blend this way and you can create really interesting effects. Wrapping it up a little bit, please remember about those differences between the properties of normal gouache versus acrylic gouache. And if you're a beginner, to be honest, I would really recommend that you first learn to paint with normal classic gouache before you want to turn to acrylic gouache. Unless you already painted with acrylic paint and you're very familiar with it, you like the fact that it dries permanently, you can handle the amount of paint being squeezed out, then go ahead and choose acrylic gouache. And then off to the question, which brand of acrylic gouache I'd recommend. So you see that here in this video, I only showed 2 types of acrylic gouache, because to be honest, there aren't, I think, that many on the market. So I just got my hands on those 2. Just be aware of the fact that Turner's Acryl Gouache is much cheaper. So if you're still not sure if it's a medium for you, I would still go ahead. It's a great quality, super nicely pigmented gouache. I would recommend it with all my heart. And then if you want to get a little bit more fancy, if you have a little bit more money to spend, then by all means, really buy at least 1, 2, or a little bit more tubes of Holbein's Acryla Gouache, because it's really great. It has really great vibrant colors, and it's pure pleasure painting with that paint. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any more questions about acrylic gouache that I haven't answered, leave them in a comment below and I'll give you my best answer. Until then, I hope you'll enjoy the video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!